Welcome, everyone, to an extraordinary journey through innovation and perseverance. Today, we explore the life of Steve Jobs, a man who believed that the people crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who actually do. An unusual beginning. February 24th, 1955, arrived cold and gray in San Francisco, California. In a small hospital room with white walls and the smell of antiseptic in the air, a young woman named Joanne Stiebel gave birth to a baby boy. But Joanne was unmarried, still in college, and unable to raise a child. With tears streaming down her face, she made the hardest decision of her life. She would give her baby up for adoption. The baby was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple living in Mountain View, California. Paul was a machinist with calloused hands and grease under his fingernails. Clara was a gentle accountant with warm eyes and infinite patience. They named the baby Stephen Paul Jobs. The Jobs family lived in a small house in a neighborhood where apricot orchards were slowly being replaced by suburban homes. The air smelled of fruit blossoms in spring and fresh-cut grass in summer. Their garage was Paul's workshop, filled with tools hanging on pegboards, the scent of motor oil and sawdust, and machinery parts scattered across wooden workbenches. Young Steve would sit on the concrete garage floor, which was cool even on hot California days, watching his father work. Paul taught Steve about craftsmanship, how to build things properly, how even the parts you couldn't see should be made with care. When you're a carpenter making a beautiful chest of drawers, Paul would say, wiping his hands on a rag, you're not going to use a piece of plywood on the back, even though it faces the wall and nobody will see it. You know it's there. So you're going to use a beautiful piece of wood on the back for you to sleep well at night. The aesthetic and quality have to be carried all the way through. Steve never forgot that lesson. It would shape everything he created. A different kind of student. Steve started school in the late 1950s, walking to class down tree-lined streets where mockingbirds sang and sprinklers created rainbows on suburban lawns. But school was torture for young Steve. He was bored, restless, and frustrated. His fourth-grade classroom had pale yellow walls and rows of wooden desks that smelled of pencil shavings and old varnish. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust particles dancing in the beams, while other children sat quietly copying assignments. Steve fidgeted, daydreamed, and caused trouble. He set off small explosions in class. He released snakes. He put a homemade explosive under his teacher's chair. The principal called Steve's parents repeatedly, his voice exasperated over the phone line. Everything changed when Steve met Imogene Teddy Hill, a fourth-grade teacher with silver hair and kind eyes. She recognized that Steve wasn't a troublemaker. He was bored. His mind worked faster than the curriculum allowed. One afternoon, Mrs. Hill approached Steve's desk. Sunlight illuminated the math worksheet he had deliberately left blank. "Steve," she said quietly, kneeling beside his desk so their eyes were level. "I know you're smarter than you're showing. What if I gave you a challenge? If you finish this math workbook, I'll give you $5 and a giant lollipop." Steve looked up, interested for the first time in months. A challenge, a reward, recognition. He finished the entire workbook in 2 days. Mrs. Hill kept her promise, presenting Steve with a $5 bill and an enormous lollipop in front of the class. But more importantly, she had taught Steve something crucial. When you're passionate about something, when you're properly motivated, you can achieve incredible things. By the end of fourth grade, Steve tested at the 11th grade level. The school wanted to skip him ahead several grades, but his parents refused, worried it would be too much pressure. Still, Steve never looked at education the same way again. He learned that traditional schooling wasn't always necessary. What mattered was curiosity, passion, and the drive to learn. The electronics garage. The Santa Clara Valley in the 1960s was transforming from agricultural land to the birthplace of the technology revolution. Garages that once stored farming equipment now housed electronics workbenches. Engineers and tinkerers gathered in backyard workshops, creating the future with soldering irons and circuit boards. Steve's neighborhood was full of these engineers. They worked at companies like Hewlett-Packard and Fairchild Semiconductor. Their garages glowed with warm yellow light late into the night, the smell of melting solder drifting into the cool evening air. Steve would knock on neighbors' doors, asking questions about electronics. Most adults would have shooed away a curious kid, but these engineers recognized a kindred spirit. They showed Steve circuit boards, green fiberglass with silver traces like electronic artwork. They explained resistors, capacitors, transistors, and how electricity could be controlled to create intelligence. One summer day when Steve was 12, he decided he wanted to build a frequency counter, a device to measure electronic signals. The problem was he needed parts he couldn't afford. So Steve did something that would define his personality forever. He looked up William Hewlett, co-founder of Hewlett-Packard, in the phone book and called him at home. The phone rang in Hewlett's house, a comfortable home in the hills with a view of the valley. Hewlett picked up, probably expecting a work call. "Hello, Mr. Hewlett," Steve said, his voice nervous but determined. "My name is Steve Jobs. I'm 12 years old, and I'm trying to build a frequency counter. I need some parts, and I wondered if you had any spare parts you could give me." Most CEOs would have been annoyed by a random kid calling their home. But Hewlett talked with Steve for 20 minutes about electronics. Then he gave Steve the parts and a summer job at Hewlett-Packard. That summer, Steve worked in the HP factory, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the smell of electronics. He assembled frequency counters on an assembly line, watching engineers test equipment, learning how companies turned ideas into products. The experience planted a seed. Someday, he would start his own company. Meeting Wozniak, a perfect partnership. In 1971, when Steve was 16, a mutual friend introduced him to Steve Wozniak. Woz, as everyone called him, was 5 years older than Jobs, already in college. But they connected instantly over their shared love of electronics and pranks. They met on a warm California afternoon, sitting on a curb outside Woz's house. The sun cast long shadows across suburban streets. Woz showed Steve something he had built, a blue box, an illegal device that could trick telephone systems into making free long-distance calls. Steve's eyes lit up. "We should sell these," he said immediately. Woz was shocked. "That's illegal." "We won't keep doing it forever," Steve replied, his mind already calculating costs and prices. "But think about it. We could make money while learning about business." They built and sold blue boxes together. Steve handled sales and customers while Woz perfected the technology. It was illegal and risky, but it taught them something crucial. They made a perfect team. Woz was the brilliant engineer who could build anything. Steve was the visionary who could sell anything and see what the world needed before the world knew it needed it. Reed College, dropping in. In 1972, Steve enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. The campus was beautiful, brick buildings covered in ivy, tall trees creating shadowed walkways, rain frequently pattering on leaves and pavement. The air smelled of wet earth and pine trees. But Steve hated the structure. Reed was expensive, and he felt guilty making his working-class parents spend their life savings on an education he wasn't sure he wanted. After just 6 months, Steve dropped out. "I'm dropping out," he told his parents over the phone, his voice echoing in the dorm hallway. "But I'm not leaving. I'm going to drop in. For the next 18 months, Steve lived as a dropout who attended classes that interested him. He slept on friends' floors. He returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food. He walked 7 miles every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna Temple, where candlelight flickered on orange walls and the smell of curry filled the warm air. Most importantly, he took a calligraphy class. The classroom was quiet and peaceful, with high windows letting in soft gray Portland light. The teacher, an old monk, taught students about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the space between letter combinations, about what makes typography beautiful. Steve was mesmerized. He had no idea this knowledge would ever be useful. He just thought it was beautiful, and beauty mattered to him. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, Steve would say years later, the Mac would never have had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. India and Enlightenment. In 1974, Steve traveled to India seeking spiritual enlightenment. He was 19, thin and intense, with shoulder-length hair and piercing eyes. He wore simple cotton clothes and sandals. India was overwhelming. The heat pressed down like a physical weight. The streets packed with people, cows, and rickshaws. The air smelled of spices, incense, and humanity. Temples rose with intricate carvings, their walls ancient and weathered. Holy men in orange robes sat by rivers, meditating as smoke from funeral pyres drifted across the water. Steve walked through villages where life hadn't changed in centuries. He ate simple food from banana leaves. He shaved his head. He studied Buddhism and meditation. He searched for answers to life's big questions. After 7 months, Steve returned to California transformed. He hadn't found all the answers he sought, but he had learned something important. Intuition and simplicity mattered more than complexity. The best solutions were often the simplest ones. Zen Buddhism's emphasis on minimalism and perfection would influence every product he ever created. The birth of Apple. Steve returned to California in late 1974. He took a job at Atari, a video game company housed in a building that hummed with electronic energy. The office smelled of solder and pizza. Engineers worked long hours in dim rooms lit by computer screens, creating the first video games. Steve worked night shifts because his coworkers complained about his poor hygiene and abrasive personality. But Atari's founder, Nolan Bushnell, saw potential in the intense young man. Steve learned about business, design, and how to create products that were both fun and profitable. Meanwhile, Woz was attending meetings of the Homebrew Computer Club, where computer enthusiasts gathered in a Stanford auditorium every Wednesday evening. The air buzzed with excitement as engineers shared circuit designs and programming tips. Fluorescent lights glared down on tables covered with early computers and tangled wires. In early 1976, Woz designed a computer that could be built cheaply but was much more powerful than anything similar on the market. He showed it to Steve, who immediately saw the potential. "We should sell these," Steve said, just as he had said about the blue boxes years earlier. Woz was hesitant. He had a good job at HP, but Steve was persuasive, relentless, visionary. He convinced Woz they could change the world. On April 1st, 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ron Wayne, who would soon leave the company, founded Apple Computer Company in the garage of Steve's parents' house. The garage was cramped and cluttered, lit by a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Tools hung on pegboards. The concrete floor was stained with oil. The smell of electronics mixed with the California sunshine streaming through the door. This humble space would be the birthplace of a revolution. They named the company Apple for several reasons. It was friendly and approachable. It came before Atari in the phone book, and Steve had just returned from an apple farm and thought the word sounded fun, spirited, and not intimidating. Building the dream, Apple II. Their first product, the Apple I, was just a circuit board. Customers had to add their own case, keyboard, and monitor. It sold to hobbyists and geeks, about 200 units total. It paid the bills, but barely. Steve knew they needed something better, a complete computer that anyone could use, not just electronics experts. The Apple II would be that product. Steve obsessed over every detail. The computer's case had to be beautiful, not the industrial beige of other computers, but a warm, inviting color. It had to look like it belonged in a home, not just a laboratory. The edges had to be smooth and friendly. Even the circuit board inside, which most users would never see, had to be elegant. Engineers protested. Why does it matter if the circuit board looks nice? Nobody will see it. Steve's response echoed his father's garage lessons. I will see it. We'll know it's there. The Apple II launched in April 1977 at the West Coast Computer Fair. The convention center buzzed with hundreds of computer enthusiasts. Fluorescent lights reflected off countless circuit boards and blinking LEDs. The air smelled of solder, coffee, and excitement. Apple's booth stood out. While other companies displayed circuit boards on folding tables, Apple had an elegant display with plants, warm lighting, and computers that looked like consumer electronics rather than laboratory equipment. Steve stood at the booth in a suit, though he rarely wore one, demonstrating the Apple II with the passion of a preacher sharing gospel. The Apple II could display color graphics. It could play sound. It came in a complete package ready to use, and it was beautiful in a way no computer had been before. Orders poured in. Businesses bought them for spreadsheets. Schools bought them for education. Families bought them for games and learning. The Apple II became the computer that brought personal computing to the masses. Apple moved out of the garage into a real office building. The company grew from 3 people to dozens, then hundreds. Money flowed in. Steve Jobs, still in his early 20s, had created a successful company, but he was just getting started. The visit to Xerox PARC. December 1979 was foggy and cold in Palo Alto, California. Steve drove to Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, a research facility where Xerox scientists were inventing the future. The building was modern, with glass walls reflecting the gray sky. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over laboratories filled with cutting-edge technology. Xerox had agreed to show Steve their latest inventions in exchange for the opportunity to invest in Apple. What they showed him would change computing forever. In a demonstration room, a Xerox researcher sat at a computer with a strange new device called a mouse. On the screen, instead of just text commands, there were little pictures called icons. Windows opened and closed. Menus dropped down. You could point at things and click them. It was called a graphical user interface, or GUI. Steve watched for less than 10 minutes before jumping out of his chair. "Why aren't you doing anything with this?" he shouted, his eyes wide with excitement. "This is revolutionary. This is the future." The Xerox researchers shrugged. Their management didn't see the commercial potential. To them, it was just a research project. To Steve, it was the future of computing. He returned to Apple obsessed. Computers needed to be intuitive, something anyone could use without reading thick manuals or memorizing complex commands. If you could point at what you wanted and click, computing would be accessible to everyone. This vision would lead to the Macintosh. But first came disaster. The failure of Lisa and the birth of Mac. Steve poured Apple's resources into creating a computer with a GUI called the Lisa. named after his daughter, though he denied it for years. The Lisa was beautiful and innovative, with a graphical interface and mouse control. But it was also expensive, $10,000. Far too costly for most people. The Lisa failed commercially. It was Steve's first major failure since founding Apple. And it hurt. But something else hurt more. Apple's board of directors removed Steve from the Lisa project, concerned that his demanding and abrasive management style was hurting the team. Angry and humiliated, Steve took over a small, low-priority project called the Macintosh. The team was working in a separate building, a two-story structure with large windows and an open floor plan. A pirate flag flew from the roof, representing their rebellious spirit. Steve turned the Mac team into an elite unit. He pushed them relentlessly, demanding perfection. His management style was brutal. He would call ideas shit or insanely great, with nothing in between. He reduced engineers to tears with harsh criticism, but he also inspired them to create something extraordinary. Real artists ship, Steve would tell them, meaning that ideas were worthless until they became real products that customers could use. The team worked 100-hour weeks. Late at night, the Mac building glowed with lights. Rock music blasted from speakers, and the smell of pizza filled the air. Engineers slept under desks. They argued passionately about every pixel, every sound effect, every detail. Steve obsessed over the Mac's design. The computer had to be friendly, approachable. It should make people smile. The icons had to be perfect. The fonts had to be beautiful. Even the way the computer booted up had to feel magical. On January 24th, 1984, Steve Jobs introduced the Macintosh at Apple's annual shareholder meeting. The auditorium was packed with thousands of people. Stage lights illuminated Steve as he stood alone on the dark stage, wearing his signature outfit, jeans, and a black turtleneck. "Hello, I'm Macintosh," the computer said in its synthesized voice, speaking for itself. "It sure is great to get out of that bag." The audience erupted in applause and tears. The Macintosh showed the world what computers could be, friendly tools for creativity, not intimidating machines for experts. The famous 1984 Super Bowl commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, positioned Apple as rebels fighting against the conformity of IBM. The ad cost $900,000 and aired only once, but it became one of the most famous commercials in history. But despite the brilliant launch, despite the revolutionary product, storm clouds were gathering over Steve's paradise. Exile from Eden. By 1985, the Macintosh wasn't selling as well as hoped. It was expensive and had limited software. Apple's board blamed Steve's poor management, his brutal criticism of employees, his reality distortion field that made him believe impossible timelines were reasonable, his inability to compromise. In May 1985, after a power struggle with Apple's CEO John Sculley, whom Steve himself had recruited, Steve Jobs was removed from all operational duties at the company he had founded. He was 30 years old, a millionaire, and had just been fired from his own company. The news hit the tech world like an earthquake. Headlines blared, "Jobs out at Apple." Silicon Valley gossiped about the fall of the boy genius. Steve felt devastated, humiliated, lost. He had poured his entire adult life into Apple. The company was his identity, his purpose, his legacy, and now it had rejected him. For weeks, Steve barely left his house, a large, empty mansion in Woodside that he had barely furnished. He wandered the empty rooms with their echoing hardwood floors, trying to figure out who he was without Apple. Friends called, but Steve didn't answer. He sat alone in rooms filled with afternoon sunshine, feeling like a failure at 30. "I'm at 30 and very successful," then out of business. Steve would later recall, "I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me." But it didn't feel that way in 1985. It felt like the end. Wilderness years, next in Pixar. Slowly, Steve emerged from his depression. If he couldn't run Apple, he would start something new. In September 1985, he founded Next Computer Company, determined to create the perfect computer for universities and businesses. Next's office was sleek and modern, black furniture, minimalist design, everything perfectly arranged. The computers they created were beautiful black cubes with unprecedented power, but they were also expensive and not compatible with existing software. Next struggled to find customers. The company burned through millions of dollars. Steve poured his own money into keeping it alive, watching his fortune dwindle. The tech press, which had once celebrated him as a genius, now mocked him as a has-been. But something else was happening. In 1986, Steve bought a small computer graphics division from George Lucas for $10 million. The company was called Pixar. Initially, Steve saw Pixar as a computer hardware company that made expensive graphics computers. But Pixar's employees, brilliant artists and technicians, wanted to make animated films using computer graphics. Steve thought they were crazy. Who would want to watch a computer-animated movie? But he let them try, funding their work with his dwindling fortune. Pixar's offices in Point Richmond, California, occupied a converted factory building near San Francisco Bay. Sunlight streamed through industrial windows onto artists' desks covered with sketches and clay models. The smell of coffee mixed with the salty bay air drifting through open windows. The Pixar team worked for years on a short film called Tin Toy, about toys coming to life. It won an Oscar in 1989, proving that computer animation could create genuine emotion. But short films didn't make money. The company was bleeding cash. Steve kept Pixar alive with his own money, but he was running out. By the early 1990s, he had invested over $50 million in Pixar, money he could barely afford to lose. Friends told him to close the company. It was never going to work. But something in Steve refused to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was vision. Maybe he remembered his father's garage lesson about craftsmanship, finishing even the parts nobody sees. Toy Story: Resurrection. In 1991, Pixar signed a deal with Disney to create the first fully computer-animated feature film. The movie would be called Toy Story, about toys that come to life when humans aren't watching. The Pixar team poured their hearts into the project. Artists worked 100-hour weeks, perfecting every frame. The film's director, John Lasseter, insisted that the technology serve the story, not overshadow it. Characters had to be believable. Emotions had to be real, despite being computer-generated. Steve watched from the sidelines, still funding the company, but letting the creative team work. He had learned something during his wilderness years. Sometimes the best thing a leader can do is support talented people and stay out of their way. November 22nd, 1995, the day Toy Story premiered, dawned clear and bright in Los Angeles. That evening, Hollywood celebrities filled the El Capitan Theater, a historic venue with ornate decorations and red velvet seats. The lights dimmed. The movie began. For 90 minutes, the audience laughed, gasped, and cried watching Woody and Buzz Lightyear's adventure. Children sat transfixed. Adults were equally mesmerized. The animation was revolutionary. But more importantly, the story and characters were genuine and heartfelt. When the credits rolled, the audience erupted in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Critics raved. The film eventually grossed over $373 million worldwide. 1 week after Toy Story's premiere, Pixar went public with its stock offering. The stock price soared. Suddenly, Steve Jobs, who had been seen as a washed-up has-been just years before, was worth over $1 billion. More importantly, he had proven he could still create magic. But the greatest comeback was yet to come. The return to Apple. By 1996, Apple was dying. The company Steve had founded was losing money, losing market share, losing relevance. Microsoft's Windows dominated the computer industry. Apple's products were outdated and uninspiring. Many analysts predicted Apple would go bankrupt within months. In December 1996, Apple made a desperate move. They bought Next for $429 million, bringing Steve Jobs back to Apple as an advisor. Within months, Steve maneuvered to become interim CEO, then permanent CEO. He was back home. The Apple campus in Cupertino felt like a morgue when Steve returned. The buildings were painted in dull beige. The atmosphere was depressed, defeated. Employees walked the hallways with their heads down, expecting layoffs and failure. Steve's first action was brutal but necessary. He cut 70% of Apple's products. The company was making dozens of different models of computers, too many, all mediocre. Steve drew a simple grid on a whiteboard. Consumer/professional desktop/portable. We'll make 4 great products, he told the confused executives. 1 for each quadrant. That's it. People thought he was insane. How could a company survive selling only 4 products? But Steve understood something they didn't. Focus creates excellence. Trying to do everything means doing nothing well. Next, Steve brought design thinking to every decision. He hired Jonathan Ive, a brilliant British designer who shared Steve's obsession with simplicity and beauty. Together, they would create some of the most iconic products in history. The iMac, thinking different. In May 1998, Apple introduced the iMac, a computer unlike anything before it. Most computers of the era were beige boxes that looked industrial and intimidating. The iMac looked like it came from the future. It was translucent blue and white, shaped like a friendly egg. You could see through the back to the components inside, not because you needed to, but because it looked cool. The computer had no floppy disk drive, no legacy ports, only the future, none of the past. This looks like it's from a different planet, critics said. A better planet. The iMac came in flavors: Bondi blue, strawberry, tangerine, lime, grape. Computers were suddenly fun, friendly, desirable. People bought them not just for functionality, but because they wanted them, the way they might want a beautiful piece of furniture. The iMac saved Apple. It sold millions of units. The company returned to profitability. Steve had done the impossible. He had rescued Apple from the brink of death. But he still wasn't satisfied. The iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. By 2000, the music industry was in chaos. People were illegally downloading music from services like Napster. MP3 players existed but were clunky, ugly, and hard to use. The recording industry was fighting technology instead of embracing it. Steve saw an opportunity. What if Apple created a music player that was beautiful, intuitive, and legal? What if they made it so easy and pleasant to buy music that people would pay for it instead of stealing it? In October 2001, Steve introduced the iPod, a sleek white device with a circular scroll wheel. It could hold 1,000 songs, fit in your pocket, and had a battery that lasted all day. Most importantly, it was incredibly easy to use. You could find any song in seconds. With iPod, Apple has invented a whole new category of digital music player. Steve announced, standing on stage in his signature black turtleneck and jeans. Behind him, giant screens showed the elegant device. The iPod revolutionized music. Apple followed with the iTunes Music Store in 2003, where people could legally buy songs for 99 cents each. Record labels were skeptical, but Steve convinced them. Within years, iTunes became the world's largest music retailer. Apple, which had nearly died 5 years earlier, was now changing the music industry. But the biggest revolution was still coming. The iPhone, reinventing the phone. In the early 2000s, cell phones were frustrating. They had tiny screens, physical keyboards, and terrible user interfaces. Each company had its own confusing operating system. Smartphones existed, but they were complicated devices for business users, not normal people. Steve decided Apple would reinvent the phone. The project was top secret. Only a few dozen Apple employees knew about it. They worked in a sealed room that required special badges to enter. Even their families didn't know what they were working on. Steve pushed the team relentlessly. He demanded a phone that was all screen, no physical keyboard. Other companies said it was impossible. How would people type? They'll type on the screen, Steve insisted. But people need to feel buttons to type. Engineers protested. They'll learn, Steve replied with absolute certainty. The iPhone team created a revolutionary multi-touch screen. You could zoom photos by pinching, scroll by swiping. The interface was so intuitive that no instruction manual was needed. January 9th, 2007, Steve walked onto the stage at the Macworld conference in San Francisco. The Moscone Center was packed with thousands of people. Journalists crowded the press section. Cameras ready. Today, Steve said, letting the anticipation build, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. He showed 3 products: an iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communicator. The audience applauded politely, unsure where this was going. Are you getting it? Steve asked, smiling. These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone. The auditorium exploded. People jumped to their feet, cheering and applauding. Journalists scrambled to report the news. Even competitors watching the live stream knew the world had just changed. For the next 90 minutes, Steve demonstrated the iPhone with the joy of a child showing off a favorite toy. He browsed the web on a phone, something that had been nearly impossible before. He played music. He showed photos. He made a phone call, putting it on speakerphone so everyone could hear. Every demo worked perfectly because Steve had rehearsed for weeks, practicing until every swipe, every tap, every transition was flawless. When the iPhone launched in June 2007, people lined up for days outside Apple stores. The lines stretched around city blocks. People camped in tents, treating the wait like a festival. News helicopters filmed the crowds from above. The iPhone changed everything. Within years, every phone manufacturer was copying Apple's design. The iPhone created app stores, mobile internet, the smartphone revolution. It changed how we communicate, work, play, and live. Steve Jobs had done the impossible again. The final chapter, iPad and Legacy. In January 2010, Steve introduced the iPad, a tablet computer between a phone and a laptop. Critics initially mocked it, calling it just a big iPhone. But millions of people bought iPads, using them to read, play games, create art, and watch movies. The iPad became a new category of computing, especially popular with children and elderly users who found traditional computers intimidating. But behind the scenes, Steve was fighting a private battle. In 2003, doctors had discovered he had a rare form of pancreatic cancer. For years, Steve tried alternative treatments, refusing surgery. By the time he finally agreed to conventional treatment, the cancer had spread. Steve kept working through treatments, chemotherapy, surgeries. He grew painfully thin. His once powerful voice became weak, but his mind remained sharp, his vision clear. In March 2011, Steve introduced the iPad 2. He walked slowly onto the stage, dramatically thinner than before. The audience gasped, then burst into applause, celebrating not just the product, but Steve's courage. "We've been working on this product for a while," Steve said, his voice soft but determined. "And I just didn't want to miss today." It would be his last product launch. On August 24th, 2011, Steve resigned as Apple's CEO. He recommended Tim Cook as his successor. In his resignation letter, Steve wrote, "I have always said if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." 6 weeks later, on October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs died at his home in Palo Alto. He was 56 years old. His wife, Lorene, and his children were at his bedside. His last words, looking at his family, were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." A legacy that lives on. The world mourned. People left flowers and candles outside Apple stores around the globe. Strangers gathered to share memories of how Apple products had touched their lives. The outpouring of grief was usually reserved for heads of state or beloved entertainers. Yet here, it was for a businessman, a tech CEO. But Steve was more than that. He was a visionary who saw what was possible before others could imagine it. He was an artist who believed technology should be beautiful. He was a perfectionist who proved that caring about details matters. He was a storyteller who made product launches feel like rock concerts. Steve's legacy isn't just the products he created: the Mac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. It's the way he changed our relationship with technology. Before Steve, computers were tools. After Steve, they were extensions of ourselves, personal, beautiful, empowering. He proved that business and art aren't separate, that the best products come from the intersection of technology and liberal arts. That design isn't just how something looks, but how it works. That simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Today, Apple is the world's most valuable company. Billions of people use iPhones. The app economy has created millions of jobs. The smartphone revolution has connected humanity in ways never before possible. But perhaps Steve's greatest gift was showing us that one person really can change the world. That the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels who think they can make a dent in the universe, they're the ones who actually do. Lessons from a revolutionary. What can we learn from Steve Jobs' extraordinary life? First, passion matters more than credentials. Steve dropped out of college, never finished his degree, had no formal training in engineering or business. Yet he changed the world because he cared deeply about creating great products. Second, failure is not final. Steve was fired from Apple, the company he founded. Most people would have given up. Instead, he started Next and Pixar, learned valuable lessons, and returned to Apple stronger than before. Getting fired, he later said, was the best thing that ever happened to him. Third, focus creates excellence. When Steve returned to Apple, he cut 70% of the company's products. This seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't more products mean more sales? But by focusing on a few excellent products instead of many mediocre ones, Apple created masterpieces. Fourth, design is not just aesthetics, it's functionality. Steve obsessed over how products looked, but also how they felt to use, how intuitive they were, how they made people feel. Beautiful products that are hard to use aren't truly beautiful. Fifth, Perfection requires caring about the unseen. Remember Steve's father teaching him about craftsmanship in that garage. Even the parts nobody sees should be beautiful. This philosophy shaped every Apple product. The inside of a Mac was as carefully designed as the outside, even though most users would never open it. 6. Connect the dots backward. Steve's calligraphy class seemed useless at the time. His trip to India seemed like a distraction. Getting fired from Apple seemed like disaster. But all these experiences connected to create his unique vision. You can't connect the dots looking forward, only looking backward. 7th, stay hungry. Stay foolish. This was Steve's advice in his famous Stanford commencement speech. Never be satisfied. Never stop learning. Never be afraid to look foolish pursuing what matters to you. The Stanford speech, a final gift. In June 2005, Steve gave the commencement speech at Stanford University. It was a warm, sunny California day. Graduates in caps and gowns filled the courtyard, their families watching from the stands. Oak trees provided shade from the bright afternoon sun. Steve, already battling cancer but not yet public about it, shared 3 stories from his life. He talked about dropping out of Reed College, about being fired from Apple, about facing death. His words were simple, profound, and deeply personal. He spoke about following your heart, about trusting that the dots will connect, about not wasting time living someone else's life. He ended with these words, borrowed from the back cover of the Whole Earth catalog, a publication he loved as a young man. Stay hungry. Stay foolish. The graduates erupted in applause. The speech would eventually be watched by millions on YouTube, becoming one of the most influential commencement speeches ever given. People around the world were inspired by Steve's honesty, his courage, his wisdom. Even facing death, Steve was teaching, inspiring, showing others how to live fully and authentically. The man behind the myth. Steve Jobs was not perfect. He could be cruel in his criticism, reducing employees to tears with harsh words. He denied paternity of his first daughter for years, a decision he later regretted deeply. He could be arrogant, difficult, and impossible to work with. His reality distortion field, his ability to convince people that impossible things were achievable, inspired incredible work, but also burned out talented employees who couldn't maintain his impossible standards. But Steve's flaws were inseparable from his genius. His perfectionism drove people crazy, but it also created products of unprecedented excellence. His stubbornness frustrated colleagues, but it also let him pursue visions others thought impossible. His intensity exhausted teams, but it also inspired them to do the best work of their lives. We're here to put a dent in the universe, Steve would tell his teams. Otherwise, why else even be here? That sense of mission, that belief that work should matter, should change things, should make the world better, attracted the most talented people in technology to work with Steve despite his difficulty. Final days. In his final years, despite his illness, Steve continued working on Apple's products. He met with design teams from his home, reviewing prototypes, giving feedback, even when too weak to go to the office. He remained engaged in every major decision. His home in Palo Alto was simple and uncluttered, reflecting the minimalist aesthetic he championed in Apple products. Large windows let in California sunshine. The rooms were sparsely furnished with carefully chosen pieces. Books lined shelves. Photos of his family sat on tables. Steve spent his final months with Lorraine, his wife of 20 years, and their children. He reconciled with Lisa, the daughter he had initially denied. He made peace with old conflicts and unfinished business. Friends who visited were struck by his acceptance. Steve had raged against death when first diagnosed, trying every treatment, conventional and alternative. But in the end, he faced death with the same intensity he had brought to life, not fighting the inevitable, but accepting it with grace. His biological sister, novelist Mona Simpson, was with him at the end. She later wrote about his final moments, about how he looked at his family with love, about his final words, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." What did Steve see in those final moments? His life flashing before him, some vision of what comes after, the face of his loved ones. We'll never know. But those words, full of wonder, full of amazement, seem fitting for a man who spent his life creating amazing things. The world reacts. News of Steve's death spread instantly across the internet, the very technology revolution he had helped create. Within minutes, millions of people were sharing memories, photos, and tributes. Apple's website replaced its homepage with a simple black and white photo of Steve, along with the years of his life, 1955 to 2011. No products, no ads, just Steve's face, looking directly at the camera with that intense gaze. Apple stores around the world became impromptu memorials. People left flowers, candles, handwritten notes, and apples with bites taken out of them. In Tokyo, mourners gathered silently outside the Apple store in Ginza, bowing in respect. In New York, flowers covered the glass cube entrance of the Fifth Avenue store. In London, people wrote messages on sticky notes covering the store windows. World leaders issued statements. President Obama said, "Steve was among the greatest of American innovators, brave enough to think differently, bold enough to believe he could change the world, and talented enough to do it." But the most touching tributes came from ordinary people sharing how Apple products had changed their lives. Teachers wrote about how iPads helped special needs students learn. Musicians described creating albums on Mac computers. Parents shared photos taken on iPhones of moments they would treasure forever. The technology that Steve created had become the technology through which people mourned him, a poignant circle completed. Continuing the dream. Today, more than a decade after Steve's death, his influence remains everywhere. Apple continues as the world's most valuable company, guided by principles Steve established: simplicity, beauty, innovation, excellence. The Apple Park campus in Cupertino, which Steve planned but didn't live to see completed, is his final architectural vision, a massive ring-shaped building surrounded by trees, with glass walls that blur the line between inside and outside. It's called Apple Park, but many employees call it the spaceship, and it embodies Steve's belief that buildings should inspire the people who work in them. Every Apple product announcement, even now, echoes Steve's presentation style, the careful building of suspense, the one more thing surprise, the emphasis on how products will change lives, not just technical specifications. Tim Cook, Steve's successor as CEO, often asks in meetings, "What would Steve do?" Not to copy Steve. That would be impossible, but to channel his spirit of innovation and excellence. The smartphone revolution Steve started with the iPhone has transformed human civilization. Nearly everyone carries a powerful computer in their pocket. We navigate cities with GPS. We capture memories with phone cameras. We connect with loved ones across oceans. We access the sum of human knowledge with a few taps. Apps have created entire new industries: ride-sharing, food delivery, mobile banking, telemedicine. The app economy employs millions of people worldwide. And it all traces back to that January day in 2007 when Steve revealed a phone that was also an iPod and an internet communicator. The intersection of technology and art. Perhaps Steve's greatest legacy is teaching us that technology and art are not opposing forces. They're complementary. The best products live at their intersection. Before Steve, computers were judged purely on technical specifications, processor speed, memory, storage capacity. After Steve, design, user experience, and emotional connection became equally important. This philosophy has spread far beyond Apple. Today, every tech company talks about design. Every product announcement emphasizes user experience. Every startup founder knows that great technology poorly presented will fail, while good technology beautifully presented can change the world. Steve proved that you don't have to choose between functionality and beauty, between power and simplicity, between technology and humanity. The best solutions embrace all of these, finding elegant answers to complex problems. This is why a Steve Jobs biography sits on the shelves of not just tech entrepreneurs, but also artists, designers, teachers, and dreamers of all kinds. His lessons apply far beyond technology. They apply to anyone trying to create something meaningful, to anyone trying to make their dent in the universe. A personal revolution. Steve's story is ultimately about the power of individual vision and determination. He didn't invent computers, they already existed. He didn't invent smartphones, they already existed. He didn't invent animated films or music players or tablets. What Steve did was see what these things could become. He saw past their current limitations to their ultimate potential. And then he had the vision, passion, and stubbornness to make that potential real. He showed us that one person with a clear vision can indeed change the world, that it's possible to start in a garage and build something that touches billions of lives. That being adopted, being a college dropout, being fired from your own company, none of these have to define or limit you. Steve's life was proof that we can write our own stories, that setbacks can become setups for comebacks, that the opinions of critics and doubters matter less than the strength of your belief in your vision. The continuing journey. Today, the technology revolution Steve helped create continues to accelerate. Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, quantum computing, new frontiers are emerging that Steve never lived to see. But his influence remains in how we approach these technologies. We ask, is it intuitive? Is it beautiful? Does it serve humanity? Does it make life better? These questions, Steve's questions, guide the next generation of innovators. Young entrepreneurs still study Steve's product launches, learning how to tell compelling stories. Designers still reference Apple's minimalist aesthetic. Engineers still quote Steve's insistence that real artists ship, that ideas without execution are worthless. Universities teach case studies about Apple's turnaround under Steve's leadership. Business books analyze his management style, his negotiation tactics, his ability to create reality distortion fields. His Stanford commencement speech is required viewing in countless classrooms. But perhaps Steve's greatest gift to future generations is permission to think differently, to question established ways of doing things, to believe that the impossible might actually be possible with enough work and vision, to stay hungry, stay foolish, and pursue crazy dreams with absolute conviction. Conclusion: the dent in the universe. On October 5th, 2011, the world lost Steve Jobs, but we didn't lose his legacy. That lives on in every iPhone in every pocket, every Mac on every desk, every iPad in every backpack. It lives on in the millions of apps created by developers he inspired. It lives on in the design philosophy that has transformed entire industries. Most importantly, it lives on in the hearts and minds of everyone who heard his story and thought, maybe I can change the world too. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 to unwed parents who gave him up for adoption. He was raised by working-class parents who loved him but couldn't afford college. He dropped out after one semester. He failed multiple times. He was fired from his own company. He faced bankruptcy and death. But he never stopped dreaming, never stopped creating, never stopped believing that the people crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who actually do. And he proved it. From that garage in Los Altos to stages around the world. From the brink of bankruptcy to the world's most valuable company. From adopted child to inspiration for millions, Steve Jobs' journey reminds us that our origins don't determine our destinations. Your life is your canvas. What you create on it is limited only by your imagination, your courage, and your willingness to work harder than anyone else to make your vision real. Steve Jobs put a dent in the universe, a massive, permanent, beautiful dent that continues to expand and influence the world every single day. The question is, what dent will you make? The end. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. Stay hungry. Stay foolish. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Steve Jobs,